reuse them also within the, you know, what I call here Quartier Populaire de France, like the banlieue and other places of the kind with a racialized working class of the country. And that's still going on today, of course, with France still having colonies in the three great oceans, and we see high public servants sort of acquiring those skills and then using them back in France as well. So that's one way of cartographing it. The most complex way has been this one, where it's trying to show the entire space-time of the book with those three geographies you see, France, Algeria, and Kanaki, and trying to show the stretchability of time, the compressibility of time, in a way that's methodologically productive to look at the various sort of legal and military violence that have been deployed by the colonial state, but also as the resistance against it. And yeah, and the red areas you see are moments of state of emergency or full executive power, or what else, or special powers, or right now also the sanitary, the health state of emergency. So various sort of legislation that I don't want to call of exception, because you know, this violence is always there in a colonial setting, but that sort of exacerbate those logic. And lastly, I wanted to go back to internationalism, also to really insist that the violence I'm describing is not an unfightable one. And for me, the sort of the thing that really I think is both strategically and also because that's the right thing to do in the world we live in, international solidarity is the tactics that can truly not so much abolish borders, because I don't really know what abolish borders would mean, but it certainly abolish border imperialism, as Harsha calls it, or the colonial continuum itself, which is quite interesting because the continuum, you know, is like this sort of space-time surface. So the idea of breaking a continuum, I think you know, if you imagine the continuum is a sort of dough, like a bread dough, for example, that you sort of stretch, fold, compress, and all those things, like to sort of really break the dough, so to speak, you require quite a bit of energy, and internationalism is for me one way to do it. So you have several examples here that I like. I mean, Marielle Franco in Brazil, being also Palestinian, our dear friend from the Red Nation, and Nikki Stis in particular, the indigenous activist in North America, being in Venezuela with other indigenous activists and people from Kenya as well. People of Oceania and Kanaki in particular, but also Aboriginal Australians and West Papuans in solidarity with each other, and some friends of in Accra in Ghana, posing with the statue of Nkrumah, the sort of the theorist of Pan-Africanism in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. So those images for me are quite productive in the internationalist imaginary in praxis. They materialize in relation to this vision of borders. So yeah, so I think great. I did it well this time, so I'm glad. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the conversation after Nitin and Denise's presentation.
Are you able to see my screen? Yeah.
Yes.
So so thanks for that presentation, Leopold, and thanks to Antoine and to all the Agora team for the invitation. I'm really happy to be speaking in this configuration with Denise and Leopold, because I think it's very generative to think through borders and think across borders, so to speak. I just had a disclaimer, though, that my work is not on transnational borders per se, but rather on something closer home to us, urban borders, urban political borders. So it's sort of like a little bit against the flow of contemporary thought on sort of like transnational borders. What I've attempted to do in my work is to foreground this sort of neoliberal urbanization and to understand it, how it sort of operates and how like financial accumulation is driven through this sort of like imposition of borders, and how like in places like India, agrarian land sort of generates these global financial flows. And in this sort of generation, how paradoxically borders are both dissolved and enforced. So I try to think through the role of urban bordering in the governance of labor migration and in the enclosure of agrarian land. So I do this through foregrounding what I call Delhi without borders. But Delhi without borders is not regional urbanization of Delhi. It's just a moniker. It's like Médecins Sans Frontières, medicine, Doctors Without Borders. It's rather a multi-scalar inquiry into how contemporary practices of spatial production and bordering operate. And I'm personally, as a practitioner, I'm also interested in sort of how do these sort of forms of research and knowledge production, how can these be meaningfully translated into subversive forms of practice that seek to act against the grain? So I think a valid starting point for any discussion on borders must be through a border that we as spatial practitioners reinforce and rehearse almost on a daily basis, the border of the so-called global South and the global North. Differences, we sort of rehearse differences between their life worlds, between urban qualities, housing culture. What I would like to argue is that rather than taking this as an inherited concept, we should perhaps critically deconstruct it. Although its contemporary origin lies in what is known as the Brandt line that originates in the 1980s, which distinguishes relatively affluent countries from the relatively less affluent ones, hiding below its thinly veiled neutrality, to borrow from Denise, is an imperialist genealogy, which Leopold would call as a colonial continuum. It replicates inherent colonial inequalities and seeks to make invisible extractive capitalist relationships that operate underneath it. The act of unbordering then should perhaps start through removing such conceptual borders, the borders that tend to obscure our understanding of extractive relationships and financialization of land and nature. The ongoing farmer and labor struggles are often triggered by and articulated against institutional architectures that aim to uphold such global differences and dependencies. Seen after this critical debordering, through our eyes especially, movements shaping up in relation to neoliberal urbanization must not be dismissed as merely being reactionary, but rather should be seen as spatial contestations emerging in relation to capitalist dispossession. This can provide a means to both critically understand and to meaningfully intervene alongside subaltern resistance movements. So nowhere does this defining paradox of neoliberal urbanization, of a simultaneous making and unmaking of borders, become quite as explicit as at the ongoing farmer protests happening at the borders of Delhi. Delhi's borders have quite literally been fortified over the last 6 months now. This is in response to the occupation of 6 major highways leading up to the city by over 1 million farmers protesting against the new farm laws. In January, the farmers were able to breach these barricades through a planned tractor rally. They were able to reach the center of Delhi and were able to hoist their farmer union flag at the symbolic Red Fort of Delhi. So while this occupation of the center of Delhi was happening, another occupation was shaping up, albeit in the opposite direction. the occupation of agrarian lands through web of highways being rolled out at the pace of 30 kilometers per day by the National Highway Authority of India. This is nothing out of the ordinary, however. The pace of highway construction has been exponentially rising, as is evident in this graph issued by the government last year, in which the rate of highway construction has been shown to rise with the GDP from 2 kilometers per day in 2010 to about 28 kilometers per day in 2018. And this is expected to touch 45 kilometers per day in 2022. So increasingly, what is happening is that highway urbanization is becoming a dominant mode of urban and economic production in India, a driver of economic engines, as it's often described, one in which national borders, one in which operates across and beyond municipal, regional, and often national borders, opening pathways for global capital accumulation through enclosure of agrarian land. Such state-led efforts at land enclosure on behalf of transnational capital are often premised upon a discourse of developing the rural and backward tribal areas of the country. It's a reoperationalization of colonial era policies, regulations, and mechanisms meant to dispossess marginal social classes of land ownership through manufacturing and evoking urgency of building public infrastructure. So this is happening in tandem with farm reform laws that are attempting to completely deregulate and privatize agriculture farming sector in India, thus initiating an ecosystem under which subsistence agriculture will become practically impossible, and the only choice left for the farmers will be to sell their land. Therefore, the agrarian land grab being contested by the farmer unions in India is a corollary to the concomitant practices of highway urbanization and this sort of agriculture privatization. A second dominant theme defining neoliberal urbanization in India has been that of a complete marketization of housing. Consequently, there's been a great surge of private housing, accompanied by a complete rollback of state provision of affordable housing. This has led to a rise of extensive array of gray zones with worker tenements, which are referred to as tenement towns. In a Japanese-funded industrial township in the peripheries of Delhi, which was explicitly planned to spatialize neoliberal economic logics, and which I closely studied over the years, almost 500,000 labor migrants live outside the master planned areas. While the migrants appear in the health censuses, they remain invisible in the demographic census. The creation of such gray zones is central to the governance of migration under neoliberal capitalism, spaces through which labor migrants can be maintained as permanently temporary subjects, zones which can be pushed beyond the thresholds of detectability and through the manipulation of censuses and data, so that the only choice that remains for the migrants is to be permanently on the move. So the question then arises is whether to see these zones as formal or formal and informal, or rather following Gautam Bhan's proposition to see them as planned illegalities, where housing illegalities is introduced as a part of the plan rather than being beyond it. The planned exclusion of affordable housing is thus essential to what Oren Yeftakel describes as urban apartheid, the defining trend of 21st century urbanization. So understood in this way, the productive relationships of labor invisibilized under the veneer of informality become visible, and the reasons that triggered the mass reverse migration on foot post-COVID lockdown last year become apparent. However, it is worth questioning at this point if there is a way out of this. Is there a means to meaningfully act and subvert the imprisonment of such techno-capitalism, other than abstain and pretend to attain a moral ground by pretending not to partake? Is there a way of doing critical cartography and research that does not reproduce and reinforce existing subject-object boundaries? While I don't have conclusive answers to this, I think one of the ways out of this can be through what Gayatri Spivak calls aesthetic education, which can empower radical subaltern struggles. Spivak's aesthetic education calls for critical cartography and design we practice alongside subaltern subjects, where research activist subject-object boundaries dissolve. And instead of feeding into art and architecture biennales and privileged art venues, you do work directly with the subaltern subjects. This is illustrated through the in the recent popularity of socially engaged art and the resurgence of third cinema. One such socially engaged art project in which I had the privilege to be a part of, we collaborated with a women's worker union in a tenement town on the peripheries of Delhi, where the cartography itself becomes a means of archiving, protesting, and subverting through the use of creating methodologies of unmasking and of unmaking of borders. So perhaps I'll leave it at that, and we could pick up in the question and answer session later.
There we go. You hear me? Okay. Wow, 2 bombs already dropped, so I have a hard stand in kind of following up these 2 wonderful presentations. Thank you so much. I mean, yes, I'm very glad to kind of drop in here very spontaneously and to share some material with you that I gathered in the form of my PhD research, which I conduct also at EPFL, although now remotely. So thanks a lot for this super spontaneous invitation. And exactly, it will maybe be a little bit more kind of in the flow of just sharing with you some of my thoughts than like a really proper presentation, so forgive me for this. And I'm most of all really looking forward to discuss with all of you. So thanks for being here. Yes, so my PhD research and also my artistic work, which I follow since around 7 years, is kind of turning around the position of Switzerland in economic terms, in cultural terms, and mostly in historic context of the position of Switzerland, kind of with its relation to mostly an extra-European context. So in that sense, I was from the beginning quite interested in terms of neutrality and how, yes, this neutrality can act as an agent for many different means. And of course, this kind of followed up to a research which went into the often invisibilized history of Swiss coloniality, as I call it. Yes, so I'm currently working under the title Spatializing Swiss Coloniality, Spectres, Memory and Aesthetics of Invisibilization, both visibilization and invisibilization. And I have thereby kind of a material history approach to restore a fragmented kind of history between Switzerland and Brazil, namely Bahia. So I would like to start with a quote, which this short presentation kind of starts with, from Elisabeth Povinelli, from a short article where she writes that she titles, "Where is Brussels? How easy is it for city dwellers to relegate the monstrosities of colonial capitalism to places far away, or to encase their excremental flows in materials ripped from elsewhere?" And I thought I don't want to start with this kind of notion of the elsewhere, but rather of my familiar environment, and especially the built environment. I'm currently an artist in residence in Neuchâtel, and maybe some of you know this institution. It is the Ethnographic Museum of Neuchâtel in this wonderful villa, that is all too common kind of in a Swiss environment. We kind of find these villas all over the place if we consider to look, which was the private villa of this sir. This is just a screenshot from the website of the Musée d'Ethnographie de Neuchâtel. It was the private villa of James Ferdinand de Pury, who after his death kind of, dedicated this to become an ethnographic museum in 1904. How this transfer, we will come, I kind of inverse the story here. So I want to start where I am, in the city of Neuchâtel. So it is just written here, I read it in French. Après plusieurs déménagements et partages, le fonds ethnographique fut transféré sur la colline de Saint-Nicolas, dans la ville offerte par James Ferdinand de Pury, pour y installer le MEN, inauguré le 14 juillet 1904. Dans la villa offerte par James Ferdinand de Pury. Then it already continues further. So there is no other trace how this really happened. Even after recent renovations of the villa, we still cannot really know who this guy was and how it happens he owned and could build such a villa. As you can see in my presentation, I don't really have kind of an approach of mapping really, as Leopold just showed us, these immense maps, of the French role in the world, if you want to say, under colonialism. But rather to kind of go into specific places that I analyze in depth. So it's kind of an inversion. So here you see, as I am not an architect, but I thought you might like some proper architectural plan from the 19th century, 1872. This is the villa and the park, which is quite extensive. And as I learned, original as it is on a hill and kind of falling with a marvelous view on the Lac de Neuchâtel. What I thought is quite interesting here is the river that is kind of going underneath the property, this very high-end property in Neuchâtel. So exactly, as I learned later, this derogation of the river plays quite an important role, as it was not just there, always, but it has been funded by an uncle of James de Pury, who himself was, as we will learn, involved in colonial endeavors. This was one of the first exhibition views in the Villa de Pury, with a very classical diorama of the, kind of another kind of mapping of the continents, l'Asie, l'Océanie, la Chine, l'Inde, and so on. So I'm currently quite interested in the architectural details of this transition as a way of visualizing these transitions. So another quote from Povinelli, I'm kind of bombing you with her today. It seeks to make visible those who claim that the West's material wealth, as the villa that we just saw, its modern cityscapes, wealth accumulation and health, need not to take into account actions in one place and reactions in another, that one could assume all harms would wash away in the long run, at the frontier in the end. So I'm showing you here a world map. It was published also at the end of the 19th century by the Bulletin de la Société Neuchâteloise de Géographie. And we do now, we cross the Atlantic from Neuchâtel towards Brazil, namely Bahia. I don't know if you can see my mouse. So this is my mouse, yes. This is Bahia, which was really at the center, the northeast of Brazil, of slavery during since the 16th century, basically. Where we exactly are going now is Caravelas, or let's say a little bit inwards. It's a tiny town in the south of Bahia, where this drawing was made middle of the 19th century. You can see I kind of, as the topic of today is kind of, you know, this border, I thought I would like to analyze quickly with you one of these drawings done by also Neuchâtel painter in a colony that was established by several families from Neuchâtel in Caravelas. So what you can see here is kind of the Forêt Vierge, the indigenous forest of the Mata Atlantica, which kind of goes over several thousands of kilometers in the state of Bahia. And as before I show you the second part of the image, I want to read you a historical quote from a doctor, a German doctor who lived on that very same colony where they cultivated mainly coffee. The reclamation of the land, as well as the cultivation and extraction of the most important cultural products. The colonists drove another day's journey up the river into the jungle. Here the land began to become hilly, consistent of good yellow and fat loam soil, mixed with black vegetable soil, and was irrigated by beautiful streams. They therefore found the same in every respect suitable for their purpose, and turned to the government and received 5 sismarias jungle. Then it goes on, and I'll just kind of leave it with this one phrase. With a few means and hands, with the help of a few men, the heavy works of clearing the ground had to be started and carried out. So on the other side of this border, which once we will see the whole image, kind of is a symbolic border between the newly operationalized landscape and obviously racialized landscape, was put in place by monoculture of coffees. It's quite interesting, as you can see, different states of this process, the deforestation of the indigenous forest, which basically by many sources that I have was conducted by the indigenous peoples of this land themselves, which basically destroyed their own habitat, the indigenous forest that we saw before, and then the put in place of the coffee plantations. Just to give you an order, this was, yes, a plantation which was run by several Swiss families, as I said, in the proportion of 200 white people and around 2,000 enslaved Africans, which were brought to the colony and had to kind of, were exploited for the wealth of, in that case, Switzerland. Exactly. So here we do now the shift again, and you can see that somehow my goal is really in the sense of Povinelli to bring these places back together again. You know, of course they're geographically very far away or kind of you know, on another continent, but how symbolically can we reduce this distance of these two places, which basically belong together in a sense of exchange of materials. Yes, you see the name of this specific plantation was called Pombal, Colombier. Colombier is a little village just next to Neuchâtel, une plantation de café d'une colonie neuchâteloise à Brésil. So if you would think that all of this was just the endeavor of some, you know, of some private people that made capital in Brazil in the 19th century, then you must be wrong. And I think there I really come to kind of my the approach to also read the written archives as a really with a material approach, you know, like how can we read from these documents that were written from this whole history, kind of the state violence that even in the case of Switzerland was conducted there. So what do I mean with this? You see here on the right a book which is in Bern in the National Archives of Switzerland, and it's consular documents that really in that kind of highlight and keep track of all the movements that happened on this very same colony that we just saw before. So I'm quite interested in the visual, language that these documents hold. And we can see here this Agence Consulaire Suisse de la Léopoldine. Léopoldine was the name of the whole colony, the conglomerate of around 20 plantations. So in a sense, yes, we can, in that sense, really talk of a Swiss colonialism that is not only invisible, but actually very visible once one dares to look. And I want to just quickly refer to a book to close up my presentation, which is called Colonial Switzerland, Rethinking Colonialism from the Margins. It was published by Patricia Purchert and Harald Fischer-Tinet, two absolutely amazing historians. But when I recently took this book again out of my bookshelf, I really had to say, maybe I come back to you with my video. I was really thinking, if this title, Rethinking Colonialism from the Margins, if now talking about borders, are we really here in the margins, or did not Switzerland actually pay or contribute as a kind of very well-oiled wheel in this whole concept of imperialism, of Western imperialism? So this would go, of course, much further to prove this, but I think I leave it here, and I'm very happy to discuss with all of you.
Thank you very much to the three of you for this amazing first presentation. We would like to let you perhaps react on each other. I think there is a lot of really nice links to be made, and also invite anyone that has a question or remark to post it in the chat, or also just raise your hand and ask for the microphone. It's also nice if the people that are able to put on their camera. It makes the discussion much more fluid as well. Thank you very much.
I have a remark which is quite interesting. How when we use the, let's say, the colonial or the imperial or the nationalist archive, it's always interesting how resistance is always hidden, but if you scratch a little bit, you can still find it. And I guess in the case of Nitin, I see it a little bit in how the highway maps doesn't really reach Kashmir and as an occupied territory, and how the Indian settler colonial project there does not is not shown, but we can almost see it through the map. And then for you, Denise, I don't know if you saw it, but the what's his name, the James Ferdinand de Poury, who has his drawing. Maybe I can pull it very quickly. Sorry, I realize I have two computers on, and of course I cannot transfer one. Sorry, Denise, would you mind putting it back, the website? Because I thought it was pretty amazing.
Yes, sure.
It's meant to be a joke, I suppose, but it's quite interesting, right? Do you see the arrow?
Yeah.
It's completely normalized that, this kind of colonialist would be absolutely hated by people that he looted, but it's somehow even the museum managed to sort of give us a hint about it. So I find it quite fascinating. And thanks a lot for bringing one more colonial layer to my first name. I had enough with King Leopold II of Belgium, who was responsible for the death of 10 million Congolese. So I see that now I have even like a Swiss colony in Brazil as a with my name on it. So that's unfortunate. but that's something we carry with ourselves. It's quite interesting as well, I suppose.
No, it's true. I mean, this. I'm currently working with that ethnographic museum to film in their building and to kind of just be in a constant conversation with them to kind of see where this could enter, you know, that their visitors really understand what place they are standing on, literally, you know, what is this land? And yeah, and it's quite astonishing because they renovated it for 3 years, the whole museum. And I was really running there to kind of see how they spatialized, you know, this history, because I'm sure they must know it. And there was really no trace to be found. I mean, the only trace is like a marmor, how do you say, like a marble kind of huge plaque with his name on, and it says that he was a négociant en Brésil, so he was a trader in Brazil, which says actually everything. But obviously only if you know that specific history. And just to, I just want to complete this, because the river that was the like moved around, it was David de Bury that you might have followed in the media, with, whose statue in the city of Neuchâtel is still standing. So yeah, you see, I was quite interested in the way that these, you know, rivers in these urban projects of the 19th century were kind of, you know, kind of serving obviously the city, our great cities, you know, livable areas, but that money really came from dirty places, one can say.
Maybe I just wanted to touch upon something that I know from Denise's work, and perhaps she didn't have the time to present, and I think it's interesting. Correct me if I'm wrong, Denise, but much of this forest that was cleared is somehow thinking through this colonial continuum that Leopold presented about, is still a space that has this sort of eucalyptus farms and monocultures. So it sort of continues to be an operational landscape in which the sort of, even if it's a Quilombo, is it a Quilombo?
Yes, it's today this village Helvetia is a Quilombo community, exactly.
So even within the autonomy, it sort of gets embedded in this permanent dependency relationships, and I think perhaps that's quite interesting to map as well.
Yes, thank you, Nitin. Actually, these were the following slides. I just didn't want to kind of go too much over time. Yes, this is and also referring again to Leopold's amazing mapping, you know, this is kind of what I try with this one case to make, you know, to kind of see who are the actors in this new and really multiplied plantation, which in that case is eucalyptus nowadays, which is known for the fastest growing tree and the one that really deserts the soil to an extreme extent. And the owners actually of these mega plantations were all educated. The owner was educated in Switzerland in a business school in in Lausanne, which originates from Nestle. So, I mean, I'm very interested in how these national projects of the 19th century, or kind of early national, because Switzerland, in this case of Switzerland, was a very young nation from 1848. So it was establishing themselves at the time as a nation, and by consular systems, you know, establishing these extractive productions. But now it kind of moves really in this global space, and it's more about, I don't know, class or, you know, other kind of ways of moving on a global map. So I think that's kind of a big shift that happens, which makes it sometimes really a big work to trace, because it's as you both do in really huge territories, you know. So yeah, I was quite interested in you know, this more maybe method of what kind of space do you look at to your conclusions. I mean, obviously, I'm working a little bit more on you know, on a very specific examples, and I wish I could show such amazing maps that you two can. So I was maybe interested to talk about this, you know, like what's the difference of kind of going into a very kind of micro spatial analysis in versus really global networks. Or yeah, it's just like something I can only wish for I would have it.
I think it's a back and forth, really. I mean, because exactly like you said, like you encounter at some point of your research an object, a person, an event, and an event, of course, is a space-time of itself. Like it's something very localized and both in time and space, but it is part of a larger space-time. And so you can always sort of zoom in, zoom out like that. I mean, I was looking at the Musée d'Ethnographie of Neuchâtel and seeing there was a Vanuatu sculpture in the garden, and yes. So, you know, you can during your residency you can see that and you know, maybe not know much about Vanuatu, as I did not until I started getting involved with the history of Kanaki, which is the neighbors, and Vanuatu being this very strange, what's called new hybrids during a very strange co-colonial sovereignty by Britain and France at the same time. Like they were both ruling on the same archipelago in a total indifference of indigenous people there. And so you see, like all of a sudden you're back at the scale of the British and French Empire, which is huge, but you started from an object and then you can go back to it. And so I'm really interested in this sort of movement, both in terms of space and time.
Yeah, I think if I could add there, perhaps this is something I realized while doing this cartography in the socially engaged art project. It was interesting, this women's worker union that we were working with, somehow one would assume that, okay, you know, this planetary consciousness would not exist at the scale of the workers union. You know, they would not know what's outside of India or what's outside of where they are. But it's even more heightened, actually. So they would very well know that, you know, the fabric is coming from China, the buttons are coming from Thailand, the sort of yarn is coming from somewhere else, and then it's going for this company, you know, that somehow sells American apparel that sells here, or the product goes there, and then, you know, there's this sort of a very heightened consciousness about these global flows in a way. And I think in this sort of like sort of collaborative or more working alongside these sort of subaltern movements, you learn a lot cartographically. You know, you sort of give up on your inherited sort of cartographies and ways of seeing, and you somehow start to see through their eyes. And I think in this map, perhaps that's what happened, and it sort of also interplayed in one of the chapters that I wrote, where I started to see through the migrant, you know, through what it means to live in the tenement, and how do you see at the planet from the tenement, rather than from the planet to the tenement. So it's yeah, there is this back and forth, but also, yeah. I had one question to Leopold, and perhaps I'll stop after that, and we should open to the audience. Somehow, okay, this is somehow like an ongoing debate, and it doesn't have to be conclusive. Somehow when I see always Denise's example, which is a Swiss colony within a Portuguese colony, with Germans and Portuguese and Spanish, and all Europeans being somehow very complicit in this sort of settler colonial project and exploitation of nature and sort of indigenous people. How can we still talk about French Empire and British Empire? Like, should we rather not see it in through a lens of imperialism, which is not British, French, Portuguese, but rather is somehow more like, I don't know, like, I mean, when I look at 1950s and 1960s, when I look at Green Revolution, it's a very complex, it's a imperialist project in which the whole of the so-called global north is involved, including Japan, in sort of like making these operational territories produce and sort of as it's quite clear in the map that I showed. So yeah, that's a question for you, Leopold. Like, how useful is it still to think through these boundaries of empire?
Yeah, thanks. And perhaps just before I answer, I would just add something again on the sort of back and forth comment, because I also think, here I took a looted object as a looted artwork as an example, but what's very important is that every time like a French Algerian kid, young man, is in front of a white cup, essentially you have all of this that is contained within this interaction as well. So it's not some sort of like intellectual pleasing sort of exercise to be done. This is all contained whether we want it or not, and whether the people who are part of this interaction are aware of it or not. So that's, for me, that's absolutely crucial. But to answer your question, Nitin, I think it's the same answer. I think like we can zoom in, zoom out, and when we zoom out enough, then yes, indeed, we can definitely look at Eurocentric imperialism, to which Japan has also an interesting history, which I don't know if it's worth sort of getting into right now, but also seeing like the U.S. imperialism, of course, as a European project. But I don't know. For me, I'm always interested in going into details and specificities of each thing, and I do think that French colonialism and British colonialism and Portuguese colonialism and German colonialisms are not exactly operating the same thing. And some things that we can see even today, again, like, I mean, look at what's going on in France right now, is the level of fascist Islamophobia in its sort of incredible sophistication, if I may use that word, comes from also the way French colonialism was thinking of itself, and in particular vis-a-vis Algeria in particular, because that's a, sort of the great unthought in this current atmosphere of what I call like proto-fascism. And so, and similarly, the Portuguese colonialism is also interesting to look at, also in relation to actual fascism as well, with Salazar. But also, what I find interesting is when they interact as well. So, the Portuguese diaspora is the second biggest diaspora in France, behind Algerians and around the same. At the same levels than Moroccans. And many of those Portuguese people who came to France in the 60s were workers and communist activists in particular, who were running away from the military conscription of the dictatorial regime and refused to go fight in Angola, in Mozambique, or in Guinea, and arrived in France, and arrived in a status, from a status of like the proletariat of a colonizer nation to the proletariat of another colonizer nation, but no longer fully sort of how to say being in line with French whiteness, for example. So I mean, so that's quite interesting to ask the question: are Portuguese French white or not? And of course, it's not a yes or no question. But what does that mean for people to run away from fighting a colonial war and to end up living in shantytowns with Algerians, Moroccans, and Spanish refugees? So yeah, so I agree with you, and at the same time, I think the more we look into details, the more specificities appears that are very important to take into account as well. Otherwise, we're just flattening everything.
Maybe, I mean, to the Portuguese as it relates to Brazil, I mean, my case, just to say, is basically not anymore a colony. It was already the Empire of Brazil. So it actually is already post-colonial, if you want, you know, in the 19th century. But what I just recently read in this also absolutely great book of Cedric Robinson, The Black Marxism, he does these long lines of historical, you know, European imperialism, and I was quite struck by the beginning of the Portuguese project, you know, of imperial project, that basically all the financial flow came from the rich cities in Italy, you know, like the Portuguese crown had to, I mean, there were all these banlings between the Portuguese and the Spanish crown and so on. So it was, I mean, even there to talk of the Portuguese is already kind of a complicated concept, you know, because it was facilitated by Venice and, you know, like other Florence and so on. So, I mean, yeah, it stays completely, I mean, this notion of the nation, it's true that even when we think of the 17th century or 18th century, what does it mean there, you know, when we speak of, for example, the Portuguese Empire? That nation was not even that strong either, you know, at the time. Even maybe their colonial force was at some time, but facilitated again by another so-called nation, but rather actually specific cities, or actually broken down specific families. So I think this is I think the only way through is to speak of specific contexts and a very specific lens, and yeah. And really kind of respect the specific time that we talk about. And then, of course, the longue durée of these implications. I see there are questions coming in the chat. Maybe should we open up? Because I don't know, Antoine, what is your plan?
Yes. If anyone has a comment, a question, a remark that you would like to share, please do so. We had Veronique, who I think left before asking them. If not, I would start by asking and bouncing on something that Nitin said during the conversation. It was about seeing, or perhaps it was Denise, I don't remember, seeing through our eyes as a first and simple step to take. Yeah, I was wondering how also if you would like to reflect perhaps on the process of drawing itself, or in the case of Denise, of perhaps making films or taking photograph as a way of seeing, as an active way of seeing as well. And yeah, I was curious to hear perhaps a bit more about the process of making these crazy drawings that you were showing, Leopold. And yeah, just hear you talk about this process and this process of seeing and drawing together.
Maybe I could say something there. I would really recommend reading this book. I always recommend it to my students. It's called, it's a book by Michael Taussig. He's a anthropologist, visual anthropologist. And I saw his work many years ago at the Tate Museum in London. I happened to be in London in 2012, and I saw it there. And it was really, really interesting. What he does is he talks about drawing as evidencing. That the book is called "I Swear I Saw This," and he sort of like explores his own diaries, field diaries that he took while researching in Venezuela and in Africa and Australia. And what he tries to think of is places where we're not allowed to photograph, but we are allowed to draw. So like places like courtrooms, museums. Why are we allowed to draw and why are we not allowed to photograph in a museum, for example? And that's because like there are some things that can only be abstracted, that somehow we are conditioned only to abstract them. So, for example, this famous skull that the indigenous tribes in sort of like New Zealand were shrinking to half the size by boiling it. So this artifact, for example, you're not allowed to photograph because originally we've been conditioned. If we see the photograph, it would scare. It's against morality. So, but you can draw that. So he sort of investigates more in terms of like, okay, why don't we just photograph something, or why do we still draw? Why is drawing still relevant? And I think that's quite relevant for cartography as well. In the age of satellite maps, why do we still rely on very simple cartographic images? And it's sort of like an abstraction again, something that cannot be said. I mean, and here I think Philip Rikakovich's work, who was this sort of cartographer for Le Monde, is quite interesting because he doesn't believe in sort of accurate depictions, but rather in this sort of like there's this famous map of Africa where he draws it as a machine, which is being extracted to sort of metabolically spur urbanization in China, in Europe, in Americas. So it's also about like kind of these metaphors in drawing, like this sort of the one that I had in my drawing was inspired by Philip Rikakovich's this sort of like machinistic kind of extractions, So perhaps there's this for me, it's sort of like drawing is a metaphor as well. It's an abstraction, but it's also a metaphor. Perhaps I was really inspired by Leopold, your cover, which is sort of situationist. You take this Paris map and you make it the world map in a way. So perhaps that you should maybe talk about that.
Thanks, Nitin. Yeah, I mean, as I said, this map for me is not the most interesting one because it's so literal somehow. Like you just have those pieces of geographies and you have the dates during which it was under a French colonial domination. But yeah, I mean, for me, this whole process has been interesting in how trying to make it less literal and therefore to make it more interesting in the bridges that can be created from it, because the term bridge is very central to this work. not bridge as like, you know, a nice little metaphor to say, oh, let's bring people together, but also bridges, like, as you see, like the fact that, I mean, for example, the fact that Algeria was considered to be fully part of France in the same way that Libya was thought to be fundamentally part of Italy, with this whole like antique Roman mythology or this kind of, I mean, they always find some sort of justification to talk about to justify settler colonialism, and yeah, and of course mapping space and time is something that is quite complicated. I mean, I was quite interested when this book came out, and I realized it's not that interesting in the end, but the cover is quite striking. Also because of the sort of spiral dimension of time. I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because I'm talking to a lot of architects here, I suppose, and you know, I've been working on space for 15 years, or I don't know, and I remember very vividly how when I first met someone who became a friend of mine, Reni Samawani, who was a teacher at the Department of Sociology at the University of British Columbia. In like 7 or 8 years ago, she told me, like, you think about space too much, you need to think about time. And I promise you, I had no idea what she meant. Like, I had no idea. I was like, time, but time is time. Time, what does that even mean? Like, to think more of that time. And then when you actually really start to grapple with it, and that's going to be the topic of the next Funambulist, actually. Then you realize how much this is just as important as space. But then when you're able to sort of put them together, I think there's quite some things that can become operative as well. Because I do all that not for the sake of some sort of intellectual argument, but for potentially fabricating tools that can be actually useful by anyone in the context of now, and so trying to represent space and time, because also my words, you know, I mean, many of us are architects, we know how architects write, which is poorly, and so to be able to use words in addition to use maps in addition of words, for me was very productive. But to represent space and time together, it's quite a complex thing, and hence what Antoine you call crazy maps. Yeah, it's still a work in process for sure. Sorry, that was a little bit evasive, but
maybe in this, as I'm not one of the crowd of the architects who is mad about maps, one of the figures, or as Avery Gordon calls it, the sociological imaginations of I kind of try to think with the figure of the ghost, you know, or the haunting, to kind of exactly do that bridge between time and space. And I find this quite a poetic, maybe potentially approach to understand and bridge these very complex notions. And yeah, as the ghost, as a figure that we can imagine that is able to cross, you know, times but mostly linked to a specific space where, you know, like ghosts would remain where there was violence, where there's unresolved conflicts and so on. And how can the ghost then from there kind of be a historical mediator, as also Avery Gordon again calls it. So for me, I'm kind of working through also terms like amnesia, you know, that kind of try to erase time or try to erase events that are linked, that were kind of happening in a specific space, bring them again to the contemporary moment. And of course, it's a kind of a difficult figure to argue with in academia, but it is possible. And I think once we kind of enter the sense, like the senses, and really kind of approach also the land and place with a kind of a methodology of sensing, where also your book, Nitin, that you recommended totally goes into, and then Michael Tausig has other amazing literature in this regard. yeah, I just wanted to mention this, that, yeah, for me, this is also actually quite an important notion to combine, you know, and to, I mean, yeah, when I visited Helvetia myself in 2017 on several occasions, I could collect quite a lot of oral history and you know, memory that are very vividly living on this very land, you know. So in a sense, of course, the transgenerational memory is still there in this Quilombo community, which is 95% of Afro-Brazilians who have direct descendants to the enslaved Africans. And I mean, these testimonies are absolutely incredible, and they are also very violent. And how do we kind of live, or how do I, as a Swiss woman, you know, traveling there and traveling back again, being here in Switzerland in these crazy, as you called it, the most privileged universities, you know, how do I live now with the ghost of what I heard there? And how do I translate it back into, hopefully, politics in my own country? Because as we know, we live in a longue durée of, and in the continuation of this, extractivism, even in a kind of accelerated form. So yeah, this is maybe something, I can write also the book into the chat, and definitely for me, it's a really important concept to work also, again, not as the historian who, you know, likes to define specific times in which he looks at a specific problem, you know, like how can I make or write a history of this place, or the entanglement of the history of this place over almost 200 years. I mean, so this ghost somehow, or the ghostly matter, as Avery Gordon also calls it, kind of is an enabler to travel through these time and space concepts. I think she was also invited to give a talk earlier. Maybe some of the participants here in this round have followed her talk by Ali's Lab, I think in January.
This I will ask if no one else has a question. I would like to ask another one, and goes back to this. I don't know if it's a question, but more a remark. You were talking about this ghost. I will let Marc. Marc, please take the microphone.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for the lectures. Yeah, I had a question, maybe for Denise. Yeah, it's about this oppression that a part of a word has on another part. I think today, with the votation that we had on the multinational responsible, we had like a vision about. We had a debate in the country, and I think it was really interesting, because sometimes we can think that it's like an unconscious oppression, but through this debate, I think we realized that people were completely conscious of what they were winning in this oppression, and they took a position, which from my point of view is really depressing. But anyway, I was just wonder how the population was aware of this oppression in the 19th century, if you have traces or archives of the awareness of the population and their position on this.
You mean in the context of Switzerland?
Yeah, maybe more specifically in the context of Switzerland, but maybe
Yes, I mean, definitely, first of all, yes, this votation was a crucial moment, and I hope that this will also continue. And yeah, as it was a very sharp 50-50 divide, which some interpreted as actually a success in this, but yeah, so we need more. But yes, I mean, definitely often it's kind of argued, you know, like slavery was just in the spirit of the time and it was accepted, and society kind of wanted to live with it, or this was just normalized. But I mean, we have traces already from the 19th century in the case of Switzerland that there were Vorstöße, how do you say, like letters to the government, the Swiss government, that wanted the government to take a position and to actually forbid slavery for Swiss people. I mean, Swiss people being active somewhere in the world, you know, to own slaves, for example. So it's not at all the case that it was just accepted widely, and yeah, even on the government. But already then, and I think this is for me in my work quite important, is that this newly built nation, you know, in the second half of the 19th century was really profiting and kind of putting economy first. So these same people that were in the political positions then, actually a lot of them, and I trace some of these personalities had like in how do you say, involvement in slavery themselves. So they were the ones that pushed for global trade in the Swiss new constitution, and often opening up and making that trade kind of possible. So in that sense, yeah, it's still kind of the same like agency under maybe neutrality, although that is a notion that became important a little bit later. But yeah, I would answer your question. Yes, it was already a discussion, and it was not just a given. So there was already a rebellion against it. A rebellion is maybe too strong of a word, but yeah, a discussion at least. And by the colonialists themselves, or the plantation owners, I mean, they're obviously like race as a category to suppress human beings for was kind of rationalized, you know. I mean, this is a whole theory that where definitely the Swiss kind of went with and were actually even active in constituting, in making that division, you know. So in that sense, yeah, once you kind of degraded this group of people, you were able to exploit them, you know, because you kind of dehumanized them by concept. So yeah, I mean, that's yeah, I mean, there's a huge discussion in the, but on a political level, there were actually positions that wanted to forbid slavery quite much earlier than it finally was. I mean, forbid slavery, I just want to mention, I mean, I was shocked lately by, yeah, the numbers of contemporary slavery. I really think we cannot talk about the end of slavery of 1888 or whatever. It was a specific period of a specific slave system that ended, but I think it's quite dangerous to historicize this and put it into the past.
Yeah, I think you were talking about ghosts and ghosts of the past, but yeah, and these questions of visibility, invisibility, planned inegalities, gray spaces. What Nitin showed us as well, and I mean, all your presentation is that all of these questions are very, very still contemporary to our times. I was wondering if anyone still had a last question, or if you just wanted to have a last remark before we slowly close up the discussion. We also wanted to have Denise present something that is going to happen at EPFL later this year, and perhaps also say again that Leopold's book will the next book is coming out next week, which is also really exciting, and the next issue of the Funambulist just came out. So yeah, we would like to let you have a final words before we slowly close.
I would love to add a comment. It's only a comment. Thank you very much for making us think about the past. I think it's super important to be conscious of what we are and why we are this way today. And I appreciated the idea of space and time. And maybe what you said today about Swiss colonialism, to me, because I'm from the Valais, and you know, Valais was not Switzerland until 1815. So we actually, the French Revolution, I mean, we were French at the time. So it's funny to think about history that we were not Swiss. So the French history is maybe yours, or maybe it's not yours. I mean, the house I'm living, it's not our house, and we're renting the house, but it's we have flags from Louis XV, which is, you know, French king. So what is it to be Swiss? And when I think of the past, of our past, our history, I'm not thinking about this Swiss island that is so different from Europe somehow. So I think it's very interesting because this is about space and time, because the space we are now here in, I mean, it's a few cantons of Switzerland. It's not the same political space as it was in the 19th century. So it's, I think it's a really interesting way of looking backwards. So which one is our heritage? Is it the one of Neuchâtel, or is it French imperialism? It's just a remark.
That's a brilliant remark to maybe wrap up the presentation. Thanks so much for that. I mean, I couldn't agree more, because I think the nation state, as we're talking about borders today, I think the nation state borders and projection of them everywhere, it sort of obscures our understanding. You know, I'm writing this chapter right now in which one of the most present protagonist is actually a Prussian forester who is working with the British administration in basically, you know, making forests in India governable. So is it a Prussian colonialism project? Is it a British colonialism project? For me, it's imperialism. I mean, in a contemporary imperialism, you similarly, you stumble upon, if you use sort of like nation state boundaries, you stumble upon similar limitations, for me at least. I mean, an Indian can be involved in an imperialist project, even in the past, even today. So I think this sort of nation seeing through the nation state, it sort of obscures our understanding of certain processes. Maybe Leopold would disagree with that, but yeah. But thanks for your comment. I think it was really interesting.
No, I don't think I would disagree. I think it's just that it needs to be identified in which space-time we're talking about, quite simply, and see how, yeah, borders indeed are not immutable lines. They keep changing. And you know, I was thinking, Nitin, when you said, like, I'm not really looking at transnational borders. It's like if you're I mean, not even at this Indian subcontinent, even in India itself, you are at the transnational border regime as well. I mean, all those orange flags in the strike are Khalistan flags, so it's also a nation of its own as well. No, but what's interesting about, I agree, I'm very grateful, Catherine, for these comments, because also sometimes we tend to be extremely anthropocentric in the way we approach time. And so we look at colonialism as being the, you know, in the context of India, for example, we looked at it as like the mother of everything. Well, maybe India is a bad example, because then we have a fascist government that sort of claimed back some much earlier sources of inspiration, say. But quite often we don't necessarily, when something lasts for 2 or 3 centuries, we think of it as the alpha and omega of everything, when actually it is one moment of time that is very identified and that still has some absolutely fundamental impact on present reality, but it's not everything. And it's very important, because otherwise it means we live we lived in a world that Europe made doomed, essentially. So that's not I don't think that's what should be the conclusion of this sort of reflection. And yeah, thanks for the link towards the book. I would say because of French colonial projects that always wants to like promote its culture, its language, and everything. Believe it or not, it's actually cheaper to send copies of the book abroad, like any other country, than within France itself, because they have like some post office program where you can spread French culture everywhere and everything. So, so if you want to order it, then you'll definitely receive it. But I think it should be in bookstores in Lausanne and Geneva at the very least. It's coming out next Friday. But thanks again. Thanks for everyone for being here and taking a bit of your evening. And thanks again for this invitation, and Denise and Nitin for doing that together.
So if you want to meet us again, I have a proposition. I put it in the chat. I had the chance together with Julien Lafontaine, who is also a doctorand at EPFL, to organize, actually normally it would be a doctoral course, but it's open for external listeners. So if you're interested to get the Zoom link, you can just write to us, and we are quite excited about who is participating, and we're really looking forward to do the presentation. It's the 27th and 28th of May, and the 29th then is kind of a day in Neuchâtel, which, by the way, was Preußisch as well. So for a long time wouldn't also go under Swiss. So yes, feel free to check out the link, and I think, yeah, also Nitin will moderate one of the panels there. So yeah, really, we will be back there together again, which is a coincidence, if we can call it like this. Thanks again, Antoine and everyone, for listening. Sadly, we could only see like big numbers of participants, and we couldn't really meet you in person, but maybe that's for the next time.
Thank you very much. So it's really inspiring, and see you for the Unearthing Traces.
Yes, and thank you to everyone who joined. We really appreciate that. Have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you again.